when you are at that intersection of the other culture and your identity, you develop this third place, which is how you see that other culture as a result of who you are. And it's very specific, it's very individual. And when you develop that third place, like that student did that I just talked about, that is the bridge. You see the bridge ahead of you, that bridge to interculturality, that bridge to biculturalism.
Hi, I'm Nora Jones. Welcome to It's About Language. This podcast connects language and culture to life, learning, and hope. You'll experience insightful conversations with creative leaders in the fields of education, business, arts, and science. My guests shed light on the impact of language and culture on individuals and society as they share their stories and experiences. You'll be informed and inspired as we explore how language and culture make us human and bring hope in the midst of a challenging world. So, it's a great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague always, seems no matter where we go, Carolyn Gill. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi, Nora. How are you?
I am fine, and I'm excited to talk with you today because if there's one person I can think of that's about as enthusiastic as any human about language and culture, it's you. You are a firecracker about language, culture, and all the exciting things it can do for life. As a matter of fact, I was celebrating from just thinking about we were going to have our conversation today about the fact that Manchego cheese is part of your contact information. Not too many people go to Spanish cheeses in order to have their contact information. So, Carolyn, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm honored to be part of this project.
Well, thank you. And, Carolyn, you used a very interesting evocation of your own background, your own approach to things, when you said you were curious about, quote, the other, unquote. Can you define for our listeners what it is that you consider to be the other and what kind of effect that had on your life and still does?
Sure. Yeah, I've always been very curious about what I call the other, and that is essentially other cultures and people around the world who live and think perhaps in different ways, that live differently, that experience life differently than I do. And I think I mentioned, going on a vacation when I was 7 or 8 years old to Quebec with my family and hearing a foreign language for the first time, hearing French and being absolutely, with the exception of, I was certainly exposed to Spanish through Sesame Street as a child, but I grew up in a predominantly white suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes outside of the city of Chicago. So it was fairly homogeneous. So when I was 7, going to Quebec and hearing French spoken and being mesmerized by the fact that we were in a different country and it felt different. There were similarities, but it felt different. And then people were using different words and sounds and phrases to communicate. And that was absolutely just mesmerizing to me. And that was where I think my curiosity began to and which has become kind of a lifelong journey for me, is just my interest in other cultures and in the way other people live. And I've joked before with other people when I went to college. I can remember the woman who lived next door to me was from Delaware, and I had never been to Delaware. And I was so interested in what is life like in Delaware.
Oh, that exotic place, Delaware.
Right.
Huh?
What do you do? What do you do for fun? Like, what does your house look like? What do you eat? What does one do in Delaware? Because Delaware seemed, it was a state that I'd never visited, and it was very interesting to me. And then, my journey progressed and evolved with living abroad, studying abroad, etc., and landing ultimately in the world of world language publishing, which is, very fitting for who I am and for who I turned out to be. So
That's really neat. And again, I laugh every time I hear your story about the exotic Delaware story and so forth. Which languages did you study? And you say you studied abroad?
So I studied abroad. Yeah, I studied a little bit of French in grade school. A classmate of mine, his mother was from she was French. She was from Paris. She was lovely and very glamorous, and she would come in and give these very animated French lessons. That was my first kind of point of contact with a foreign language. But it wasn't until my freshman year in high school that I really became engaged in foreign language. And it was really because of one teacher. And she was an amazing, amazing teacher. She was inspiring. She was um, just, this was her craft. This was her art, was teaching Spanish. And that's what got me hooked. And, hearing music and just hearing the sounds of the language, it was my journey. And I think I was not a great high school student, but I always did well in Spanish. And when I got to college, I studied abroad my sophomore year in college in Seville, Spain. And again, I didn't have great study skills in high school and my freshman year of college, but studying abroad, not only did it change my life for a number of key reasons, but I also became a better student because I was truly engaged in the coursework, and I understood what it took to really, to do well in school. But that all happened when studying abroad. And I know when some people study abroad, they don't study at all. But
Hmm.
that was not my case. So I spent a year in Spain my sophomore year, fell in love with, Spanish culture, and then I ended up going back to Spain after I graduated college, and I taught English for a number of years, and then eventually came back to the United States.
So you have brought here even another aspect that you taught others English in Spain and so forth. For just a second, let's go to the fact that obviously part of your personality is that this otherness and the languages inspired you, and you had a teacher that inspired you. There are others for whom this kind of exposure to the other and exposure to a language that they don't understand at first seems intimidating or off putting. What kinds of experiences did you have watching your peers, watching colleagues in various places, not necessarily in world language publishing, we assume, but in places that are outside of the arena of language work? What kind of responses did you see in them? How did that vary from you? And why do you think that was so?
So responses to my journey, to me studying abroad,
Well, I was
or in
thinking more
general.
in general to the other and to hearing the language of the other.
Yeah, I think, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, just like someone who takes up piano when they're a child, or they're, an excellent swimmer, it was just something that I gravitated to. And I feel like I've always had a decent ear, which definitely helps. That I was able to make sense of language, and I was able, it resonated with me, not only in a learning the actual grammatical rules that made sense to me, everything else, and just having that intellectual curiosity for that which, is not where I have not come from, other cultures. I think that was just my, I don't know how to, it, I don't, it, I really don't have an explanation. I mean, if you believe in reincarnation, perhaps there's an explanation, but it's just something that from a very young age I gravitated towards.
And now you say when you lived and worked in Spain, or when you studied, that it was transformational in so many ways. What were those ways?
So I think, when I was 19, first and foremost, it was just the sense of independence, being in a foreign country. I feel very grateful to have studied abroad in a time where the internet didn't exist. I didn't have email. I relied on written letters from, friends and family at home. So I feel like I really was truly immersed. Um, I though I was speaking English with my classmates, my American classmates, because studied through a consortium of American universities. When I was out and about, I was really functioning in the language. And certainly when I lived in Spain as a teacher, I was completely immersed, paying bills in Spanish, going to the doctor, speaking in Spanish. So, and that was when I think, the me when I was studying abroad, it was kind of a dress rehearsal. And even though I was there for 9 months for a full academic year, which I completely recommend for anyone who is contemplating study abroad, if you can go for a year, especially if you're interested in acquiring a second language, please go for a year. But it was a dress rehearsal in terms of just like that cultural competence that I really gained when I lived there as a working person as opposed to a student, because you're totally immersed, and not only are you able to better understand the culture at a very profound level, more importantly, you're able to understand yourself, and you're able to look at yourself, your culture with a critical eye, and what's good, what's bad, and that's the bridge to being bicultural, which is like being bilingual. It's a big deal to be bicultural, to be able to operate in both cultures, kind of seamlessly. So I think that was my biggest takeaway from living in Spain. And I feel like when I do go back, which I haven't been back for a couple years, I feel, the minute I land and I'm there, it feels like home in a lot of ways.
Interesting. What are some of the elements, Carolyn, in understanding not only the culture that you're experiencing, in this case you were in Spain, but also you said you learn about your own culture. What are some of the, say, vignettes or aspects of learning about yourself and your culture and how that happened when you were in that setting in Spain?
I think just, it's a magical thing when you can, because you are immersed, because you are exposed to authenticity, whether it's, you're, in my case, living abroad. It's just a magical experience to be able to reflect on, well, this is where I'm from, and this is what we do. And I think when I was 19 or 21 or 22, I, was immature and knee jerk and like, oh, Spain, it's so wonderful. The biggest meal is during the day, and you eat, that's because that's the best time to eat the biggest meal. And I kind of was very down on Americans and the United States, and Spaniards know everything and the way they live is the best. And that's certainly changed over the years, because we're all unique, and we're all manifestations of the human spirit, and we're all doing our best. But I think it just customs, products, practices, perspectives, I think being able to analyze those American products, American practices, American perspectives, and being able to analyze that in a keener way. And I can't think of examples off the top of my head, but being able to examine those because you are someplace, because you are living in a different way. And I think you can only really do that when you are outside of your own culture.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever feel uncomfortable in your experience of learning about the other?
No, I mean, I think I've always just been so darn curious about how other people live and what, and what makes people tick. I mean, and I know that I've discussed with you. I've mentioned this to other people when it's been in context and conversations. And I was at Wilfrid Laurier University years ago, and I was waiting to meet with a professor, and I was checking in at the administration desk, and there was a quote above the administrator's head, and it said, "The world in which you live is just one model of reality.
Mm.
Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. They are unique manifestations of the human spirit." And I was so taken by that, because I have had a feeling, or it has been my impression, I should say, that when Americans, or at least my perspective, travel, it is this perception that, let's say if we're, in a foreign country and we're observing how people live, and we think, oh, maybe, not everyone's trying to be like us, but, oh, they only have one car. They're probably hoping to get a second car, or they're probably hoping to get a bigger house, or they probably don't like that. They're probably hoping that, that they, I don't know, acquire more things, etc. And that's just not the case. And I think when you travel enough, you know that that's not the case. But that quote, it's the person who said it. He's a Canadian anthropologist. His name is Wade Davis, and I ended up using that quote in a master's thesis I wrote 7 years ago about using short film, which I know you've done a lot of work with film, Nora. Using short film in the foreign language culture for teaching culture, and how short film, authentic materials in general, but short film in particular, can build students' cultural competence. And I ended with that quote.
That's very interesting. So you were working with, thank you, because I think the use of authentic film certainly in my work has been strong too. So when we turn to here, you were in the culture, you mentioned earlier that not everybody can get to the culture. You wish they would take a year abroad, for example. What made you decide to work on this film? What was the impact of seeing how film worked, authentic film worked, with regard to this other and this bridging that you're talking about?
Well, I think it was kind of the intersection of, two things: my personal interest, so this lifelong curiosity for how other people think and live, and with the fact that working for Vista Higher Learning, many of our programs have authentic content, and in particular, authentic short film. So it seemed like it would be kind of a natural, a project that was kind of a natural, organic combination of these two pretty big things. And it was powerful. I mean, I did research in a classroom. They were, I believe, mostly sophomores and juniors in college. They were using an advanced conversation program with 6 short films, and I did focus groups. I did interviews, and the data was very positive for just how these films made such an impact, made such an impression on these students, when previous Spanish courses, when they had thought of culture, they had thought of, kind of fairly superficial things that you learn in Spanish classes. You learn about, El Dia de los Muertos and La Siesta, and there's so much more. And so these short films really opened their eyes. And I had one of the students, it was just like I was salivating. He said, I forget what question I had asked, but he had said, these films really show me how people live in Mexico. Like, they show me how they think and who they are, and how they live, and what their identity is. And he's like, and it also has made me think about my own identity and my own upbringing, which that was like, okay, my work is done here, because that's the power of it. When you are watching something that is made, in this case, film that is made for speakers of that language by speakers of that language, that it's not intended for, for students of second language. And there's a woman named Claire Crampsh, who was a scholar. She's a professor emerita, I think, from UC Berkeley, but she is, has been very well known in the field of interculturality, biculturalism, teaching culture in the context of a foreign language course. And she wrote a book called Context and Culture and Language Teaching. And she talks about this notion of the third place, which is, again, I was taken with when I first read her work. And it's this intersection of being either fully immersed in another culture, or being immersed in that other culture via an authentic material, whether it's a piece of literature or a short film in this case, and how when you are at that intersection of the other culture and your identity, you develop this third place, which is how you see that other culture as a result of who you are. And it's very specific, it's very individual. And when you develop that third place, like that student did that I just talked about, that is the bridge. You see the bridge ahead of you, that bridge to interculturality, that bridge to biculturalism. So her work, I recommend Claire Cramsh's work, because she was really a trailblazer and has written a lot of interesting stuff on culture.
That's so fascinating, the fact that here is this third place to stand, not one's own culture, not the other culture, but the understanding of that culture and the new development that brings, kind of like a new personality, huh?
Exactly. And that's exactly it. And I think anyone who speaks a second language or a third language and or has lived abroad knows that they have that other side of them. Especially when you speak a second language, your personality may be a little bit different, but I think anyone that has lived abroad or spent significant time, you have it's a different experience than when you are in your own home culture, your the natural habitat which you were born into, if that makes sense.
It does. And interestingly enough, I need to do some more looking into this, but brain studies showing that indeed behaviors are change, or subtly, 'tis true, but change when a person is speaking the language of a different culture that they also know. I'm thinking about, in my case, I'm a little bit different when I'm in Croatia than I am in the United States. When speaking Croatian and acting in a more of the cultural mannerisms, if you will, of Croatia. That
Absolutely.
True for you too when you were in Spain, or what you've observed here, knowing what Claire has written and your own experiences?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think initially as a student, it was different because my language skills were good, but I wouldn't have called myself like a fluent Spanish speaker as when I studied abroad. When I lived there, however, because I was doing all those things, paying bills, going to the doctor, this was all obviously in Spanish. My language skills were much better. And so it was much easier to navigate that. And even now, I'm not speaking Spanish every day, unfortunately, but when I do, and I don't know if you find this when you speak Spanish or French or all of the many languages you speak, Croatian, that it's almost like this, it's like this massage. It's like mental calisthenics combined with like the best massage, like mental massage ever, because it's just something and it's not just speaking. It's not just the fact that I'm using different words and my mouth is moving in a different way. It's also the cultural nuances, the way you conduct yourself when you're having a conversation. When I tutor, ESL, so the majority of my students are Spanish speakers, and how I interact with them, I change. I'm not the same as I would be if I were speaking with someone in English.
That's fascinating, and I loved your image. It does feel like that. There is a refreshment, a massage, as you put it,
Hmm.
a kind of a clearing out of the system. You know, coming back to students that are experiencing powerfully, as you had talked about, culture through film, you saw them get to that third place. Sounds like their perspectives changed. Um, there are, again, lots of folks that may not be able to travel to places. I remember we had a conversation one time about the fact that some of these perspectives can change potentially just by sitting in a room. It's can do some of that magic.
Hmm.
Do you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, especially now in our country where there seems to be so much division and so much discord, um, it is, I think, important, imperative to, for us to learn about each other, for us to have empathy for one another. And I think that, as my husband will say, the best way to connect with someone, first of all, the best way to connect with someone who's different than you is to sit down and to break bread, to sit down and have a meal with them. And I think if we got out of our bubbles and circles more, within our own communities, I feel like we would be better. I mean, I'm stating the obvious. We would be better off for it because we would have more empathy. And I'm not just talking about, outside of our cultures, but liberals, conservatives, different. There's so many different factions of people, and I think if we talk to one another, talk to each other a little bit more, and tried to learn about each other a little bit more, um, we would be in a much better place than we are right now.
That third place, even
Yeah.
within the
Yes,
linguistic and cultural uh, sub communities.
precisely.
Interesting,
Precisely.
Carolyn. Now, you mentioned that you uh, tutor ESL students, and there are resources that you're providing for my website, fluencyonline.com, that help to provide a gift for those who are listening to this podcast today. What are you helping to provide for them? You're pretty passionate about it. Can you share that?
Sure. So I tutor. I've been tutoring for the past 3.5 years, students who are green card, I guess, individuals who are green card holders who have been in the United States, sometimes for even 20, 30 years, but they have not yet taken the citizenship exam to become a naturalized American citizen. So I tutor them. It's part ESL, but it's mostly focused on the citizenship exam, which is a pretty lengthy 100-question exam. They're only asked a handful of those questions, but they don't know what questions they are prior. So they really have to know all 100. The questions, I think many Americans would struggle with answering, the questions just about basic civics. So it's been a wonderful experience. I've worked with several students who have passed, and it's such a joy when they pass because you are changing their lives and helping them pass this test because there are many, as you can imagine, becoming an American citizen, many, the long list of incredibly positive implications that go along with that. Um, so it's just been a wonderful experience. And I volunteer through an organization here in Napa. But I know most communities have nonprofit organizations which have a branch that is a volunteering branch for the civics exam. So I would encourage, if anyone wants to get more involved in their community, more involved with the immigrant community, that is a wonderful way to do it. And I know, especially in Napa, we're always looking for volunteers, and especially for volunteers that speak, in my case in Napa, Spanish, but in other cities and communities there might be a need for speakers of other languages like Polish or Russian or Chinese, etc. Um, so it's a wonderful way to expand one's circle, and also give back.
That's neat, Carolyn, and it engages linguistic, cultural connections and grows the possibility for another person, but also grows the person that's working. That sounds like, again,
Exactly.
that third place that you were talking about, that new spot to be. And again, it's right in the community. Thank you for sharing that. Now, I always ask my podcast guests to turn to the persons that are listening to this podcast and encourage them to do something, invite them to do something that is part of the passion that you've shared. What would you reach out and ask them to do or encourage them to do?
I would ask people to get out of their comfort zones, to do something, whatever that is, to get out of the comfort zone of, the bubble that we're in. I know right now it may be a little bit difficult with COVID, and many of us are still sheltering in place, but there will be an end to this eventually. And I think getting involved in something in an organization, and I just explained what I do, but getting involved in some kind of organization, a community organization where you are interacting with people who are different than you, whether it's different culture, different background, different faith tradition. I think exposure to the other is incredibly enriching. And again, it helps us develop empathy, and it helps us understand and, put ourselves in the shoes of other people as they walk. And that's incredibly important, especially today.
Yeah, no kidding. Thanks, Carolyn. That's a great invitation. And it strikes me, I'm just imagining you for just a moment as a lovely second grader going to Quebec and being exposed to the other language, the other experiences, the other cultural settings, the other behaviors, and how you have brought that into your life, into your career, and into this invitation here today. It's powerful.
Well, thank you. I'm very grateful to be here. Like I said at the beginning, it's an honor, and I love talking about this stuff. I really do.
Well, you can tell your passion is very clear, and thank you so much for the invitation to everyone to enter into that journey as well, and to make a difference by reaching out more specifically and in a more focused way. So thank you, Carolyn. It's been a pleasure to have you here today, huh?
Same here, Nora. Thank you.
All right. Do take good care and keep reaching out, my friend.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Let's continue the conversation. Be sure to check out my website, fluencyonline.com, to learn more about our guests and to check out the resources and information they've shared with us there. I have other ideas, resources, and opportunities there for you too. Again, thanks so much for listening, and until next time,